Okay. I am live and I don't know if anybody's there. Oh, the number's growing. People are there. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. I'm sorry I'm a couple minutes late. Isn't that the way it goes sometimes? There's Faggy. Good afternoon. Hi, Faggy. Thanks for joining us. 7 people so far. Let me see what it's like if I log on to the Shared Zedek webpage here. I can up my viewership by logging into another device and logging on to my own class. Yeah, that's true. It's true. It's working. Okay, so we are live. Well, welcome, everyone. Dr. Debbie. Wow, Dr. Debbie, thank you for asking. Felix is doing very, very well. Felix is, I think he's sleeping at the moment. Let's see. Yeah, maybe he'll make an appearance. He factors into today's talk, actually. He kind of does. He does factor into the theme. So what should I do here, though? Maybe I'm going to change my setup, get the computer up a little bit higher here, and then work my background a bit. Oh, I like this. Oh, I like this quite a bit, I think. Yes, there we go. That's good. I'm not as smooth with some of this stuff as my partner, Rabbi. We're back. Sorry about that. Over my shoulder, I pulled some things. First of all, you can see change table behind me because this is Felix's change room as well as my office. And you can see a few things that I put on my, I don't know if you can see some of this. First of all, my bar mitzvah booklet. How about that? And a copy of my bar mitzvah invitation that someone turned into a clock. Never worked as a clock. Stuck on 420. But it's back there as well as a few other kind of things. And so I'm, decorating and then of course everything. So yes, welcome. It's nice to have you here. I'm back. I disappeared, but I reappeared. Please, someone in the chat, let me know that I reappeared. And Chag Pesach Sameach to y'all as well, Shelly Chachnoff. It is so great to have you in a class. It's nice. It's a nice group. We have a minyan. So if others are going to join us, that's fine. Let's get into it. I'm going to share my screen. And load up the PowerPoint. There we go. As you can see, here's today's class. By the way, I'm really looking forward to this. This is going to be a lot of fun. And I timed this out so it won't be I'm not gonna go long. I have this tendency sometimes to over prepare and have all these great stories, but today I'm feeling good about it. Today I'm feeling good. There you go. Oh, you can still see me. Oh, okay. Okay, I get it. Okay, so now I just wanted to make sure. So now you can see that. Okay, good. I've got my device open. Anyway, perfect. Perfect. Here is today's class. I came up with this actually. I'm usually a last minute kind of guy, but I came up with this a couple months back when I think we were still expecting. We didn't know if we were having another boy or not. And I thought, I just started thinking I need a Passover lunch and learn topic. I need a bring your own lunch and learn. I want to hear, by the way, in the chat what people are having for lunch. And I thought to myself, well, if we have another son, I remember all this stuff in Judaism. There's all this stuff in Judaism about the Bechor. That's a Hebrew word, right? The Bechor, the firstborn. And something called the Bechorah, which is the birthright. It's got a feminine conjugation, but the birthright. And how it's a big, big deal. And I thought, there's a bit of a Passover connection. And I'll explain that in a second. So here we go. Birthright or birth wrong? By the way, all titles and comments are me. I didn't have any help. I came up with that clever one myself. Birthright or birth wrong? Here's the question we're going to look to explore. Is it better to be born first into a family or later? A Jewish perspective. So, obviously, these sorts of things are on my mind. In the end, we had a second son, and so I have a firstborn son, Hugo, and I have a secondborn son, Felix, and so I've already started thinking about birth order and all that kind of stuff. So that's on my mind. But then there is a tie-in here very much. This is a Passover topic. And I know Fagi was there. If you were with me this morning for Minyan and you followed the Torah reading for today, day 3 of Pesach, first day of Chol HaMoed, this is the English translation of the entire, as it says, Exodus chapter 13. This is the Torah reading that we read this morning for Passover. Take a look at it. I highlighted a couple of the lines that really stand out to us as being important. So we know that on Passover, there were the plagues, the 10 plagues. And we know the 10th plague was the harshest. And we know that the 10th plague was the killing of the firstborn, Makat Bechorot. Pharaoh's firstborn son, everyone's firstborn son, and all of the animals' firstborn as well. All killed in this 10th plague, while the Israelite firstborn sons were spared because of the ritual involving the lamb's blood and the doorposts and lintel, is that what it's called? The mezuzot and the mashkaf, to mark the houses so that whether it was the angel of death or God, we're not positive, right? There's different kind of reports in the same story. We know that there's a connection with firstborn sons. And so here is Exodus chapter 13. So in the Torah, in Exodus chapter 12, that is where the plague unfolds, the 10th plague. And that is where they kind of take off. And then here is Exodus chapter 13. God said to Moshe, set aside for me all the firstborn. Whatever is first from the womb among the people of Israel, both of humans and of animals, belongs to me. It goes down, it continues. Verse 12, you are to set apart for God everything that is first from the womb. Every firstborn male animal will belong to God. And then a little bit more in verse 15, reminding us of the situation with Pharaoh. And then this last part at the end of 15 is very key. This is why I sacrifice to God any male that is first from the womb of an animal, but all the firstborn of my sons I redeem. Redeeming the firstborn sons. Anyone ever heard of the Pidyon Haben ceremony? We'll get to that in a second. That's the connection. But here we go. Exodus chapter 13, and I put up the English, but I will tell you that the idea of this first from the womb, this source translates the Hebrew phrase Peter Rechem, as being first from the womb, literally opening the womb. This is significant for a couple of reasons. First of all, with the animal world, there is no way that we would be able to know, ancient times, maybe even now for sure, who the dad animal was, but we certainly know who the mom animal is. So that makes it possible for the whole animal kingdom. And we know that there is a connection in Judaism and Judaism passing through the mother for the same reason, because the mother could be clearly identified and the father, there was always a little bit of potentially doubt, especially in the ages before paternity tests. By the way, if you just talk to Hugo, my first son, for 30 seconds, you'll know he's my kid. He's definitely Heather's kid too, but he's very much my kid. But that's not what we're talking about here. So that's important here, this idea of Peter Rechem. Because firstborn, you may be asking, firstborn to the dad, firstborn to the mom, who? Well, here in Exodus chapter 13, the link is to the mom, the first one to open the womb. And this is very important because actually there are technicalities with cesarean sections. There are certain wonderings if a woman has a miscarriage, how it affects. We can look at maybe a little of those details, but it's very important, this concept of Peter Rechem, opening the womb. That is what it says here in Exodus chapter 13. So right after the 10th plague, right after all the Egyptian firstborns are killed, but all the Hebrew firstborns are slaved, God comes back and tells Moses, because of what just happened, all the firstborns of yours, of all the Israelites, male, female, like human and animal, belong to me. The animals have to be sacrificed to me. The humans have to be redeemed. And we know it's a long time ago, and we know it's a patriarchal world, and we know they're talking about sons. But I think it's just we're putting that out there, right? That the Bechor has the special status because of the Exodus and the 10th plague. That Pidyon Haben ceremony, if anyone's heard of the Pidyon Haben ceremony, you know what, I'll stop sharing and go back and check out the chat for a second. If anyone, oh yeah, I'll tell you about that. So yes, okay, so Debbie, you said that Benny, your son, had it. Firstborn children, or really, truly, Debbie, it's a male kind of thing going on here. I think for our purposes, we can extend it to maybe be thinking about men and women. But you know how the Torah was at this time; like it was all men. Like that's just the world that we're exploring and living in. And I think we can extrapolate from that going forward, which we will at the end here. By the end here, I mean. But they're talking about firstborn boys. And for the animals, actually, that's an interesting point. They're looking for firstborn male animals too, because they needed the female animals to keep producing more animals, but they only needed a couple of male animals. That's why if you actually go through the sacrifices in different places in the Torah, it's almost always male animals that are being sacrificed because they didn't need as many. There was an economic or practical perspective to that. But what we're talking about here, we're talking about firstborn men, for sure, for sure. I want to see what everybody's eating. We can see you in here. That's perfect. So I made fried matzah, eating it right now. It's good. That's great. I love it. Slice of room temp spinach, feta frittata, and espresso. I like it. I like it. So a Pidyon Haben. This has really fallen out of favor. I don't know any of my contemporaries who have done this. We didn't even do this, and the reason we didn't do this is because I'm a Kohen, actually. And Kohanim and Levim, their firstborn kids do not have to be redeemed. But a Pidyon Haben ceremony, if you want to talk about it, Debbie, and share a little bit in the chat, basically, when you have a firstborn son, because he needs to be redeemed, for whatever reason, we'll explore why that is in a second, you bring him to a Kohen, someone who's a descendant of the priests, the Kohanim, who worked in the temple. And for special 5 coins, and there are Kohanim, I know like my great-grandfather had one of these sets, a Pidyon Haben set, where there's like that you give the Kohen 5 silver coins, and he gives you back the kid and says, okay, we're good. And you have to do it after 30 days, to the end of the first month, to make sure that the kid probably practically is going to make it. And I had one friend ask me about doing a Pidyon Haben for his son, but other than that, and I've never done it as a Kohen. I don't know if my dad's ever done. I've never really heard of this being. It's one of those things that's really not done outside of Orthodox circles. It's a little bit interesting. It's probably a little bit weird too for parents, I think, probably to figure out if that's what they're gonna go through it. But the Pidyon Haben ceremony has its roots in this Exodus chapter 13 that we just read. That because of the 10th plague, God says all the firstborns, I could have killed them. I didn't. I saved them. They all belong to me. The animals forever you got to sacrifice, and the sons you got to redeem. So let me share my screen back. And it's very important that it establishes the mother as the line, right? The mother is very key. If we go back here and we flip into another section of the Torah, Numbers, book of Numbers, chapter 13, just a little thing here. God said to Moshe, I have taken the Levites from among the people of Israel in lieu of every firstborn male, that is first from the womb. There you go again, Peter Rechem, among the people of Israel. The Levites are to be mine. All the firstborn males belong to me because on the day that I killed all the firstborn males in the land of Egypt, I separated for myself all the firstborn males in Israel, both human and animal. They are mine. I am God. Why am I showing you this? Because what does it mean that the firstborn males belong to God? The popular interpretation is that they were to go into service for God, working in the Mishkan, in the wilderness, or working in the temple. But that never, probably a little impractical, but it never ever actually got off the ground. It never happened because instead God said, in lieu, right? In lieu of all the firstborn males, I will take all of the Leviim. They will not have a land portion in the land of Israel. They will work in the temple instead, and they will replace the firstborn males. That's the connection. That's the deal right there. Okay? I mentioned it before. It's in my notes. I'm just going to say it again. Because of this Peter Rechem, because of this insistence in here, it's again, first from the womb. Caesarean section. If, you know that line in Macbeth? I love that line in Macbeth. No man of woman born shall harm Macbeth. And Macbeth thinks, oh, I'm fine, it's fine. Well, it's because Macduff was born, spoiler alert, it's because Macduff, who gets Macbeth in the end, was born of C-section, right? And they're fighting and they're dueling. And it's like another reference here for you, you know, in Princess Bride, when they're dueling, you duel very well. Yeah, there's something you do not know. What? I am not left-handed. Well, Macduff has this, there's something you do not know. I was born by C-section. If a woman gives birth by C-section, that baby does not need to go through a pidyon haben. Didn't open the womb. And the second kid, even if the second kid does come naturally, no. And then it gets very complicated actually with miscarriages. You know, with pidyon haben, the general rule is that a miscarriage does not disqualify a pidyon haben. That if a woman has a miscarriage but then gives birth naturally, that first son is going to be going through a pidyon haben. So the easy rule, C-section, no. Previous miscarriage, yes. And the last thing I wanted to tell you is, did you know about, just on this whole idea, that another connection to Passover is something called the fast of the firstborn? You hear about this? We talk about it a bit. The fast of the firstborn. It's supposed to be like the day of the first, like of Erev Pesach, leading into the first Seder. But when it happens on Shabbat, like it does this year, the fast is on Thursday. The idea is that in recognition for being spared, all firstborns need to do a day of fasting, just a sun time, like not a Yom Kippur or Tisha B'Av fast from sunset to sunset, but from sunrise to sunset. However, this is one of the best loopholes in Jewish tradition. They say you do not need to fast if you can partake in a seudah, a festive meal. And since a seudah is always supposed to follow finishing a tractate of the Talmud, we set it up, and we do this actually. Rabbi Mas did a little video. We study the end of a tractate. It's not Orthodox, they do this. They study the end of the tractate of Talmud so that they can have a seudah, and so that all of the firstborn don't have to keep fasting. It's a ta'anit bechorot, the fast of the firstborn. It's a great little loophole, one of the best loopholes in Jewish tradition, Jewish law, and it's connected to our little story here. So this is kind of setting the groundwork with this connection between Passover and firstborn. But it's not the only place in the Torah where we see the firstborn, the Bechor, being a big deal. We see it in a lot of other places. For example, this story, Genesis chapter 25, at the end of the chapter. You know this story. Abraham and Sarah were the first Hebrews. They had Isaac, through whom the Jewish line was passed, and Isaac had twins with Rebekah, Esav and Yaakov. Esav was born first. Yaakov was hanging on to his heel. That's part of why they named him Yaakov, because there's a connection with Ekev, with heel. So Esav is the Bechor. Esav is the firstborn. Esav has the birthright, the Bechorah. And here's the story. Yaakov was cooking some stew. Esav, I love this translation, comes in from the open country exhausted and said to Yaakov, please let me gulp down some of that red stuff. That red stuff, I'm exhausted. This is why they called him Edom, red. Yaakov answers, and I highlighted it, first sell me your rights as the firstborn. I'm about to die, said Esav. What use to me are my rights as the firstborn? Yaakov said, first swear to me. So he swore to him, thus selling his birthright to Yaakov. Yaakov gives his brother the bread and lentil stew. He eats, drinks, gets up, walks on his way. Thus Esav showed how little he valued his birthright. This is a very famous story from the early part of the Torah about the younger brother making a deal, a legitimate deal, to acquire that birthright. We'll see why this would have been a big deal. It's not just status, but there were legal ramifications to this deal. And of course, we know that in a couple of chapters, to kind of add to it, Jacob then steals Isaac's deathbed blessing intended for firstborn Esav. So he steals the Bechorah, the birthright, and the Beracha, the blessing. There's a very important midrash we'll refer to again, that there's a reference here, Jacob purchased the birthright in order that he might serve God. I'm highlighting this now, not for the first part of this midrash, but for the last part, just to point out that as Jewish thought goes, as Jewish thought developed, what Jacob did to buy the birthright was not frowned upon, but applauded by the rabbis. I find that very interesting. Jacob didn't steal it. He was conniving and a trickster, no question. But the deal was legit, and the fact that he was motivated to do it so that he may serve God is applauded. I think that's important. But where else do we see the significance of the birthright in the Torah? Another place in Genesis, in chapter 49, Jacob, years later, reunited with his children, with Joseph and everybody in Egypt, is on his deathbed, and he's going through everybody, and he says to Reuven, you are my firstborn, Bechor. I wanted to grab the Hebrew here with my trusty Etz Chaim Chumash, because the Hebrew was really good, and I didn't get them on the same page. He says, he goes through everyone, he's giving them his deathbed blessing, Jacob is, and he says, Reuven Bechori Ata, Kochi V'Reshit Oni. Translation, Reuven, you are my firstborn, my strength, the first fruits of my manhood. And then he goes on to tell him what a disappointment he's been. Though superior in vigor and power, you are unstable as water, so your superiority will end because you climbed into your father's bed and defiled it. He climbed into my concubine's couch. That is very ambiguous. They think that that's an allusion to Jacob finding out that Reuven actually got with, I can't remember if it was Bilhah or Zilpah, one of the other mothers, right? Because Rachel couldn't get pregnant. She had a lady servant. And Leah could keep getting pregnant, but she also had a lady servant. And those lady helpers were also mothers of some of the Jacob's sons. And Reuben got with one of them. Not trying to be vulgar or anything, just like trying to explain that. But the more important thing in this excerpt is number 3. Because not only do we see the term Bechor, but we also see, like, look what my strength, the first fruits of my manhood. I can tell you this from personal experience. I've kind of felt it. Some people have kind of said, what's the big deal with being born first? When Felix was born, it's not like I was already a dad, but when Hugo was born, it transformed me. It transformed Heather. Before that, we were not dad and mom. When he was born, we became dad and mom. The firstborn does that, right? It changes everything. The second one changes everything in different ways, but not in that same way. So the first fruits of my manhood, Reshit Oni, his virility, his manhood was connected to Reuven. So you can see that it's not even just about birth order, but about there's significance there. And of course, there's this, that from a legal perspective. Now, this is very interesting. I find very interesting because remember, we talked about Peter Rechem, we talked about opening the womb, firstborn through the mother. But here in Deuteronomy chapter 21, there's this scenario. You see it before you. A man has 2 wives, one he loves, the other unloved. By the way, why did he marry the one he didn't love? That seems cruel and unfair. I just don't get it. And both the loved and unloved wives have borne him children. And if the firstborn son is the child of the unloved wife, then when it comes time for him to pass his inheritance on to his sons, he may not give the inheritance due the firstborn to the son of the loved wife in place of the son of the unloved one, who is in fact the firstborn. No, he must acknowledge as firstborn the son of the unloved wife by giving him a double portion of everything he owns, for he is the first fruits of his manhood. We see it again, and the right of the firstborn is his. This is interesting because it connects the firstborn to the father. This is not peterechem. This is not about opening the womb. This is about who is the dad, the father's firstborn son, from a legal perspective. You see, there's two aspects to Bechor in Jewish law. There is a worship perspective, animal sacrifice, working in the temple, Pidyon Haben, redemption, all worship, all connected to the mother's firstborn, the mother, the peterechem, the opening of the womb. But then there's also a legal side, an inheritance issue within Jewish law that says the father's firstborn son is entitled to a double portion of his inheritance. What does this mean? It doesn't mean that he gets twice as much. You got to be very careful. It means that all the sons would get an equal portion. So say I had 4 sons, 1, 2, 3, 4. You'd think each is entitled to a quarter of my inheritance, but actually no, you divide it into 5. The firstborn gets 2 quarters or half. No, sorry, 2/5, and all the other ones get 1/5. Sorry, my math may have made that confusing. If you have 4 sons, let's just do it with 2 sons. If you have 2 sons, it's not a 50-50 split. If you have 2 sons, you divide the inheritance into 3 parts. The firstborn gets 2/3. The second son gets 1/3. Maybe that's a little clearer. And that actually, interestingly, as far as Orthodox Judaism is concerned, has a role even in today in crafting wills. Now, there is a loophole there too, where you can gift assets to avoid maybe, but you have to leave a little bit behind. And according to Orthodox law, someone's inheritance, someone's will should be set up that if there are multiple children, the firstborn son gets a double portion. I read about it. I'm telling you, it seems wacky, but it's true. And it's all because of this, what we read right here in Deuteronomy chapter 21, that even if the unloved wife has the firstborn son for the man, the firstborn son gets the double inheritance. That's why Jacob's deal with Esau would have been more than just a title. He made a deal. He traded some soup for a double portion of Isaac's inheritance. No wonder Esau was so ticked off when he found out. It's pretty interesting stuff. Oh, no, I didn't want to do that. Let's go back. I wanted to stop sharing for a second. Okay, just checking in with everybody at the halfway mark. This is great. Lentils, what did he do? He lay with her, he knew her. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Okay, that's good. I see there's some good chatting. It's great that you're I don't know, aren't Bikurim the first fruits? Yeah, that's right. Bikurim is from the same root, first fruits, what we give, Chag Shavuot, Bikurim, Chag HaBikurim, it's the same root in Hebrew. And womb, yes, Rechem, Rachamim, the Hebrew word for mercy, does come from Rechem, absolutely. They're connected to the same root. So I find that very interesting here. A couple of examples in the Torah, and the connection here is through the dad. The connection through the dad, very, very important. So we know I mentioned this thing about the, this idea of like the manhood. You weren't a dad until your firstborn son was born, and then you became a dad. But also in a very practical way, in ancient times, there was the lineage was passed through sons, and the firstborn son is always mentioned in all the different Torah genealogies. You see the word Bechor mentioned again, and that son is always mentioned first in the genealogies. So there is the important thing, I think, is that there is this legal inheritance side through the dad, being the dad's firstborn son, and a worship, redemption, sacrifice side through the mom, through opening the womb, when it comes to Bechor. Now, next part. What's interesting for me is that in spite of what we see here in the Torah, in Jewish law, about a preference for the firstborn son, more inheritance for the firstborn son, a connection to the worship. I saw Debbie's Debbie, your question about there not being no sons, only daughters. There is an example. There's a very famous story in the Torah of a man named Slofchad, who was in the tribe of Menashe and had no men, only daughters. And the daughters go to Moshe and they want the inheritance. And Moshe works out a deal, and God is very happy. You should go check that one out to refer to your example there. But so I'm just setting the scene here. We have this context where we see all this law, we see all this legal material, what a big deal firstborn sons are. But now think back with me to and I'm not going to put up any slides right now because I wanted to just kind of go through, these stories. Think back to some of the stories from especially from the book of Genesis, where so much of that book is family dynamics, different generations through the families, and there's a lot about sons. Again, ancient, patriarchal, not surprising. Who's the first family in the Torah? Adam and Eve. Their sons are Cain, born first, Hevel, Abel. Cain and Hevel, Cain and Abel, those are the first two sons. Cain is the firstborn. Yet, when they both go to bring offerings for Hashem, it is Hevel, it's Abel, who is looked upon favorably. God prefers Abel and Abel's offerings. The irony here is that, or just the funny thing maybe, is that the Torah says Abel gives Bechorot Tzono, the firstlings of his flock. And that's why, because Cain tried to pass off some gross vegetables and some not good stuff, and Abel gave up the choice, the best, the firstlings of his flock. So God preferred Abel's offering. He preferred the younger son over the older son. And then we know Cain goes out into the field and kills his brother. Next story. Abraham, first Jew. His first son, now not for the mother, not Peterechem, but his first son is Yishmael. And yet it's Yitzchak, Abraham's second son, who gets the covenant and the promise of supernumerous offspring and all of that jazz, and Judaism passing through Yitzchak. Is this not another example of the younger son being favored over the first son? It's not a perfect example because actually, if you look closely in places like Genesis chapter 16 or Genesis chapter 21, Yishmael, in spite of the way that Sarah especially and also Abraham kind of treat him and his mother, Hagar, Ishmael does explicitly benefit from God's covenantal promise to Abraham, and Ishmael is told that he will be made into a great nation as well, a very numerous nation as well, and receive a lot of blessing. And we know this because Islam traces back to that and that promise. So it's not a complete example, kind of like Abel over Cain, of the second son being preferred, but there is still an element of the second son getting something that the first son doesn't quite get. Though Ishmael isn't completely left in the cold, Yitzchak still does get the covenant, the brit. And that, of course, was because of Sarah. We talked about Jacob and Yaakov and Esav. And I'll remind you again about that Midrash that applauds Yaakov for making that sneaky deal to buy the birthright, the Bechorah, from Esav for the lentils, because he wanted to serve God. So that's another example, just another example of the second son overtaking, or the younger son overtaking the first son. There's another example. Later, it's not exact. It's interesting to me. It doesn't get talked about as much. We talked a little earlier about Reuben, how he was Jacob's firstborn son. But throughout the episode, I mean, we know all about Joseph being favored, and there's a little bit of a weird commentary that I found, that because Joseph was Rachel's first son, he was entitled to a larger inheritance, which I don't quite love or make a lot of sense of. But Throughout the narrative involving the brothers and Joseph, you know, the animosity, the selling him into slavery, faking his death, him going down to Egypt. They have to go down during the famine. They don't bring Benjamin. They have to go back, get Benjamin, come back. They don't recognize Joseph. Joseph accuses them of all kinds of things. You know that whole story? Throughout those chapters at the end of the book of Genesis, Reuben, the oldest, fails time and time again. He fails repeatedly trying to be the leader of the brothers. When they throw Joseph in the pit, Reuben tells him, don't do this. No, come on, let's not. No one listens to him. When they go down to Egypt and they don't recognize Joseph and he's giving them a really hard time, and they all think this is because we were cruel to our brother, that we're getting payback. Reuben is the completely unhelpful guy. He's just like, I told you we shouldn't have, you know, the I told you so. I told you we shouldn't have thrown him into a pit. Like, not helpful at all. Bad leadership. And then later when they go back to take Benjamin and then return to Egypt, and Jacob doesn't want to let Benjamin go, Reuben says, come on, trust me. If anything happens to Benjamin, you can kill my 2 firstborn sons. And Jacob's like, what are you, an idiot? Your sons are my grandsons. That's not a good deal. And every time Reuben fails as the leader, it's his younger brother, the 4th brother, Judah, Yehudah, who steps up each time and becomes a better leader. He becomes the liaison with Joseph in Egypt. He is the one who convinces Jacob to let them take Benjamin down to Egypt with them and assures Jacob that they will all be together again. Judah, who's a younger brother, a later born, assumes a higher position, a higher status from Reuben failing. So there are just all these stories throughout the Torah and throughout especially Genesis. I mean, even in the book of Exodus, I think you can make an argument. You had Moses, the star of the Torah, 5 books of Moses. He wasn't the firstborn son in his family. He had an older brother, Aaron, and an older sister. And yet he rose to higher heights. Now, Aharon, of course, became Kohen Gadol. He was no slouch. But in the billing, it ain't Aaron and Moses. It's Moses and Aaron. Yet another example of the firstborn son being kind of superseded by a later born son. So how do we reconcile these 2 general pieces of information? The first piece of information that tells us there's law that says the firstborn male is preferred, that he has to be redeemed, that he could go into service for God if he's not redeemed, that firstborn male animals have to be sacrificed, that the firstborn son is entitled to a double portion of inheritance. How do we reconcile that with the fact that all these stories suggest that the firstborn son, time and time again, was a loser? I don't know, right? We have all these examples of these firstborn sons, and even in Jacob's blessing, his deathbed blessing to Reuven, he's like, you were my firstborn son, the fruit of my manhood. Gosh, you've disappointed me. It's like they can't live up to these expectations that are put onto them. But it is very interesting that we have these, I feel like there's 2 competing ideas, because the stories seem to suggest it's better to be born later, but the law seems to suggest it's better to be born first. What does science have to say? Well, if you do a little bit of reading on the internet, as I have, you can get really bogged down in a lot of these studies and the technical terms, and it reminds me of science fair all over again. It is very fascinating, but it gets a little bit dry. The big study came out in 1996. There was a book by a fellow named, was a psychologist. I think he's connected with Berkeley, if I remember. His name's Frank Sulloway, S-U-L-L-O-W-A-Y, Frank Sulloway. And he wrote a book called Born to Rebel. And it came out in 1996. And it's a very famous study that gets a lot of other studies coming from it, as we'll see in a second. And he did his whole study and everything. And his findings in general were that birth order affects personality. If you do a little Googling on this, I wasn't going to get super scientific because I don't think that's what we're looking for here. But I just wanted to let you know that there are, like, scientists, psychologists wonder The same thing I opened up with. Now that I have two sons, will Felix feel like he has to act a certain way? Will his personality be affected by being born second? Will Hugo's personality be affected by being born first? It's way too early in my life to know. I am curious about it. I want to see how it plays out. But Frank Sulloway, in his book Born to Rebel, studied the big 5 personality traits: what openness, conscientiousness, how agreeable you are, some different category, and it gets very specific, right? But his general finding was that birth order does affect personality. Let me read to you from the abstract to his study, to his book. On average, firstborns who tend to act as surrogate parents are more conscientious than laterborns, whereas laterborns are more agreeable, extroverted, and non-conforming. There's some little more information I can distill in a sentence. According to Sulloway's findings, in general, firstborns are more socially dominant, less agreeable, and less open to new ideas compared to laterborns. All of you now who have siblings, think about it. I'm thinking about my life. I am the older of 2. I've got a younger sister. Am I more socially dominant? No, we're both socially dominant. Am I less agreeable, less open than my sister? Not really. I don't see in my sibling relationship birth order making a lot of difference. If anything, I think it works to my disadvantage. But that's for me to unpack with my therapist. Not really. I don't have a therapist. Should maybe get one. What was I saying? Oh, yeah. I think about my wife's family. She has an older sister and a younger sister. No males, 3 girls. And I have always seen birth order at play in those relationships. That's just my perspective, coming into it a little bit later. And I'm sure all of you think about your siblings, if you have siblings, or friends, or cousins, or genetics plays a role, but sometimes just sheer birth order. It may look, and there are some people who think that you're born first, so like it says, you act more like a surrogate parent. I think about my mother-in-law, who was literally forced into a surrogate parent role by being the oldest of 4 kids when the 4th kid was born, because the mother was not well. She got recovered, but my mother-in-law, who was 10 at the time or something, had to step up and be like a parent to this 4th kid. How does that not affect the sibling relationship? I took care of you when you were born. You're my little brother. Do what I say. Like, it just makes sense, right? And so in 1996, in the book Born to Rebel, Frank Sulloway has this whole study. He produces this findings, and he says personality is affected by birth order. Firstborns are less agreeable, less open to new ideas, more socially dominant. They act like surrogate parents. Therefore, the younger ones are more agreeable, but also extroverted, and also non-conforming. Don't like to be told what they're going to do. They're going to break out. Well, the medical, psychological study world didn't. Some people were like, way to go, Sulloway. Some people said, no, sorry. We're calling you out. We don't buy it. And there are many, many studies out there that are derived from Frank Sulloway's original study that go the other way, that counter, and that there's a lot of documented evidence out there, scientifically speaking, that birth order has no effect on personality whatsoever. So I encourage you, if you're interested in this sort of thing from the science perspective, do some Googling. Frank Sulloway, Born to Rebel, start there, see what else you get. And you'll find that there are studies that say birth order does affect personality. And you'll find studies that say maybe a little, and you'll find studies that say not at all. So all this to tell you that there have been studies, there are still studies being done going on right now. Find some current stuff, but that there is not a scientific, it's not like gravity or magnetism, like a proven thing. If I drop an apple, it will fall. Being born first does not necessarily mean squat. Faggy's number 5. So true. I like being told what to do. Very interesting. Very interesting. So, depends who you read, depends what studies you get into. And of course, you can nitpick over methodology and things like that. But it's unclear scientifically if birth order affects personality. Now, let's go back to our PowerPoint. And let's take a look at one more selection from the Torah. Back to Exodus, where we started our conversation. Chapter 4. So this is before the plagues. This is before. This is when Moshe is just becoming, just after the burning bush. He's going to go to Pharaoh for the first time. It's kind of like God foreshadowing the whole scenario. But there's a line in here that is so interesting. And it'll lead us to our final thought, our concluding thought for today's class. And by the way, thank you so much for joining me, bringing your own lunch and learning. This was a lot of fun for me. Let's see what we've got here at the end. Exodus chapter 4. God said to Moshe, when you get back to Egypt, make sure that you do before Pharaoh every one of the wonders I've enabled you to do. Nevertheless, I'm going to make him hard-hearted, and he will refuse to let the people go. Then you are to tell Pharaoh, God says, Israel is my firstborn son. And this foreshadows the 10th plague, which is where we started our conversation. I have told you to let my son go in order to worship me, but you have refused to let him go. Well, then I will kill your firstborn son. And by the way, in Egypt, as you probably could guess, like in Israelite society, it did follow this system, which the fancy name is primogeniture or primogeniture. I'm not sure how to spell it. How to say it. Primogenitore. It is the system wherein the firstborn son has a hierarchical advantage, a double inheritance or whatever. Egypt operated on that system too. That's how Pharaoh became Pharaoh. The next Pharaoh was the Pharaoh's firstborn son. British monarchy works like that too, right? We've seen this in places before. So that's why the 10th plague, the killing of the firstborn son, it wasn't just here like, Israel's my firstborn son, so I'm going to kill your firstborn son. It completely ravished their organization, their structure, their system in Egypt. But this line in verse 22, chapter 4, verse 22, Israel is my firstborn son. What an interesting thing. Now, may I remind you of that midrash that I shared with you earlier, back when we had the Jacob story? What is the meaning of Israel is my son, my firstborn son? Because we know practically he wasn't. If you're looking at it on the level of like just facts, Esau, remember Jacob and Israel, same person? Esau was firstborn. Israel was secondborn. So how can God be calling Israel my firstborn son? Bechor. Well, the Midrash says Jacob purchased the birthright in order that he might serve God. Again, it's a favorable look at Jacob buying that birthright. So that's why we get back to Exodus chapter 4. God says, Israel is my firstborn son. Well, where can we take this? And where does this take us for today? To kind of bring things together in this idea of, is it better to be born first or is it better to be born later? Well, science, we're not going to find the answer in science. Unless you only read one study. And I'm not sure if we find the answer here in the Torah. Because was it better to be Cain or Abel? Well, that's a tough one. Was it better to be Ishmael or Isaac? Was it better to be Esau or Jacob? Was it better to be Reuben or Judah? Was it better to be Aaron or Moses? There's no question that Jewish law gives more rights and privileges to the firstborn son. But like with a lot of things, there's also a lot more responsibility. And there's disappointment associated with Reuben, for example, not living up to his firstborn status in Jacob's eyes in a different way from maybe other brothers. Other brothers who did the same thing wouldn't be as much of a disappointment. So yeah, it's like with great reward, with great power comes great responsibility. Isaac, I see Jerome's question. Ishmael was Abraham's firstborn son. Remember? Yeah. So how do we make sense? How do we use this line, Israel is my firstborn? Well, I found a rabbi. Her name is Rabbi Anna Bonheim. She's a Reform rabbi. And looking through the Reform lens, I just wanted to read for you. She had written a Devar Torah related to the Parsha that began our class today with the Peter Rechem and everything about the connections to the Passover story and the firstborn son. And just let me read to you a little bit. Earlier in Exodus, God tells Moses, Israel is my firstborn son. This is another way of understanding the covenantal relationship between God and Israel. God loves and protects Israel as a firstborn, and in return, Israel will forever belong to God. God expands the emphasis on the firstborn as a way to emphasize the developing peoplehood of Israel. Today, we can use the concept of Israel as God's firstborn as a way to broaden the meaning of the firstborn's ties to God. Essentially, we are all symbolic firstborns, consecrating ourselves to God by actively choosing Judaism and a Jewish life. Not because we're in debt to God, or because we have to, due to birth order or lineage, but because Jewish tradition offers a way to understand the world, our history, and our place in it with depth, meaning, joy, and compassion. It's ironic that the killing of the Egyptian firstborns in the 10th plague is a primary event that sets up the covenantal relationship between the Israelites and God. Yet it's also a reminder that our covenant came with a heavy price. We can choose that special firstborn relationship as a way to understand choosing Judaism. And yet we must also remember that our firstborn symbolic uniqueness is tempered with the memory of a legacy that includes the 10th plague. Great words from Rabbi Anna Bonheim, a Reform rabbi who mused and wrote, and I really liked what she said. I'll add a kind of concluding thought to wrap it up and connect it to Passover again. If we are all, I love that idea, if Israel as a people, that's the way it is in chapter 4, verse 22 of Exodus, is if Israel as a people is God's firstborn, then we are all firstborns. We all have that power, but also that responsibility. Choosing a life of heightened responsibility is therefore always within our reach. The stories in the Torah of Abel, Isaac, Jacob, Judah show that even birth order, ironically, given the other Jewish laws we study today, isn't the be-all and end-all. Jacob made a deal and bought his birthright from his brother, and the Midrash says, Yasher Koach. Right? Judah, we're called Yehudim. Think about where that came from. The tribe of Judah, the southern kingdom, all from potentially Judah asserting himself over Reuben as a leader. The Torah tells us that, yeah, birth order matters, but nothing is without of your reach if you want it, that you still have a choice. And at this time of year in Passover, when we all are supposed to be reimagining ourselves coming out of slavery, when we choose freedom, we can choose to live up to being God's firstborn, whether we're the firstborn in our family or not. See, look at that. 4 minutes to 1. I told you we would be done in time. If you have any questions, I can take a couple more questions in the chat. But I do want to thank everybody again. I really, really appreciate Rabbi Leibl Mas helping me and guiding me through this platform. And I want to thank Dr. Rina Sector-Albaz for organizing this whole Lunch and Learn series as part of our adult education movement or department. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in, bringing your own lunch and learning. It was a pleasure. And if you have any more questions, you can throw them in the chat, or when we sign off, you can always contact me by email, and we can follow up with more discussion. Hopefully you found this as interesting as I find it. I'm fascinated by things like birth order and how Judaism makes such a big deal about it, and how we take something like that and look at our lives today. Hopefully we were able to do all of that. So in answer to the question, is it better to be born first or born later? I don't think it matters. It's all about how you act and what you choose. How's that? Toda Rabbi, everyone. Chag Sameach. Have a great rest of today and a great rest of Pesach and Passover. And we'll see you next time. Bye.